Our guest today is Jurgita Ashley, a partner of Thompson Hines in Cleveland. We're going to talk about listing on the Nasdaq. I'm Brock Romanek today on Zippy Point. So Jurgita, listing on Nasdaq, listing transfers, uplisting, lots of things to pick from here. So why don't we start with you talking to us a little bit about that initial listing application? What's involved with that, the preliminary steps?
Well, thanks, Brock. We have been receiving increased interest in uplistings and listings transfers from one stock exchange to another, and particularly to Nasdaq. And I think there are really three main preliminary steps that every company should take before companies spend any time on preparing the listing application or other listing documents. I think first, companies should take a look at stock exchanges' financial requirements for initial listing to determine if a company qualifies as this, or if there is any corporate action, for example, a reverse stock split that should be undertaken. It's also important to take a look at shareholder records early on to ensure that the company has a minimum number of round lot holders. A round lot holder is a shareholder who holds at least 100 shares. So for example, Nasdaq requires a minimum number of unrestricted round lot holders, and also requires that at least half of them hold securities with a minimum value of at least $2,500. Second, the company should look to see if anything needs to be done on the corporate governance front. So is it as simple as just making a few changes to committee charters and other corporate governance documents, or does the company need to go out and recruit additional independent board members or implement new corporate governance procedures? And third, the one that's not always at the top of the minds is that companies should collect and review the history, the regulatory and litigation history for the company itself, as well as its officers, directors, and significant shareholders. It's part of the application process, and it's something that every company will want to review in advance.
And then what about listing transfers? For example, the transfer from the New York Stock Exchange to Nasdaq, how does that work?
Well, the process is relatively straightforward for the listing transfers, whether it's from New York Stock Exchange to Nasdaq or in reverse. The documentation is not very complicated. It's unlikely that there will be any significant corporate governance changes that will be necessary, and they're receiving a waiver of fees for the listing year, which companies always like to hear about. It doesn't take very long for Nasdaq to review these applications, and I won't go into timing in detail, but did want to mention a couple of timing considerations. So first, this listing timeline may need to be coordinated around other corporate actions, everything from a securities offering, M&A activity, a self-tender, to sort of more routine things, stock splits, reverse stock splits, even a quarterly dividend timeline, to really a shareholder meeting timeline as well. And then second, if a company is listing other classes of securities besides common stock, such as preferred stock or senior notes, it's important to take a look at the terms of those securities. Every company will want to determine what's permissible under those documents, and also if there are any notice or approval requirements.
And then what about uplistings, the over-the-counter market, OTC to NASDAQ? How does that work?
So for companies that are already reporting with the Securities and Exchange Commission, again, it's not very complicated. The average listing timeline it's around 6 weeks after the listing application is submitted. So there is a little bit more of a delay at this time, but usually we're looking at 5 or 6 weeks. Now, that's different for companies that have securities quoted over the counter and that do not currently file reports with the SEC. Here, when we're talking about uplisting, what we're really talking about is a going public transaction. And it can take a number of forms, right? It can be like a traditional IPO, it can be a reverse merger, filing Form 10 information with the SEC or something else. But in all of those cases, preparing the SEC filings and audited financials, related due diligence and implementation of controls and corporate governance policies, those things will be much more labor intensive and will impact the timing much more significantly than a stock exchange listing itself.
And before we started, you mentioned that for some companies, it's more attractive to be on Nasdaq because it seems like more of a technology stock exchange. And so given the huge rush for tech stocks over the last few years, it makes sense that some companies would look to do that.
Absolutely. We definitely see many more companies wanting to move to NASDAQ frequently for this reason.
Well, thanks. Love the artwork behind you. That's the sort of style of art that we have in our house. And I need to put something like that in here. This is my son's old bedroom. So
you have a beautiful background.
Well, if you saw the sides, it's all kiddie stuff, but he's no kid anymore. But in the back, it's got the Harry Potter books and things like that.
I like that. I like Harry Potter books.
Things he'll need for one day, maybe some grandkids for me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brock. Always a pleasure talking with you.